we're now going to move to our second speaker, which is Shanta Martin, who's a partner at Leigh, who's going to speak about Leigh's litigation in the UK on modern slavery. Shanta, over to you.
Thanks, Phil. Is this working?
Yes, I think it is, yeah. It is now.
Use both. All right, we've only got a very short period of time, so I'm only going to try and do two things, but I suspect I'll only be able to do one. So I might try and squeeze the second in during questions. But those two things are, firstly, to just give you a very brief rundown on the facts of the case that Leigh is assisting in terms of bringing pretty much the first complex claim by victims of trafficking in the High Court against a British company, and that is the Houghton's case, which is referred to in the agenda for today. And the second is actually to then try and place that litigation into its broader context, and specifically to look at it from the victim's perspective, really, in terms of, well, effectively some of the things that actually we're just hearing from Nick about, which is about litigation just being one tool in the tool belt. So just very briefly, the Houghton's case is actually Galdicus and DJ Houghton Catching Services Limited and others. And Antonis Galdicus is the lead claimant of 16 claimants. All of these claimants are alleging that DJ Houghton Catching Services, which is a British company based in Kent, was responsible and liable for having trafficked the claimants and other workers to the UK from Lithuania, and having then subjected these claimants to severe labour exploitation. The reality is that the victims actually worked for the Houghtons between 2008 and 2012, so quite some time ago now, but actually only started the litigation in 2014 after they were introduced for the first time to solicitors who would be able to bring forward this kind of litigation. So as I said, the defendants are the British company, so DJ Houghton Catching Services, but also two individuals who ran that company, so the company secretary and the director, who are collectively referred to as the Houghton defendants for ease. And they're also suing the Gangmasters Licensing Authority, which is the fourth defendant in the action. And the GLA is basically the authority which has, public authority, which has as its core function to regulate gangmasters and protect vulnerable workers. And the claimants allege that the GLA fundamentally failed in its duties. But specifically about the Houghtons, what the claimants are alleging is that, as I say, they were trafficked into the UK and then subjected to labour exploitation between 2008 and 2012. That according to the complaint, the men, whose ages range between 19 and 58 at the time that they were working, so it's incredibly difficult work and nobody disputes that, and they did range very much from very young to, certainly the more senior of them is now finding it very difficult to get around. But they allege that they were driven from farm to farm across the UK, travelling many hours, going from, for example, Kent down to Penzance and then back to Kent, and working along the way, and effectively only being allowed to sleep in the minivan that was transporting them from farm to farm. That they were put to then gruelling work in filthy conditions without adequate training, personal protective equipment or personal protective clothing. That they were housed by the Houghtons in overcrowded and bed-bug-ridden accommodation. That they had unlawfully deducted from their wages various spurious claims for things which included unlawful deductions for rent, unlawful deductions for an employment fee, and occasionally just had their wages completely not paid to them for reasons such as, for example, leaving an unwashed mug on the kitchen sink at the home in which they're staying. So one of the key allegations is that the claimants were simply not paid what is their statutory minimum wage under UK law, which is actually a criminal offence. If you do not pay according to the Agricultural Wages Act, it is a criminal offence, and one of the key allegations is that they weren't paid that statutory minimum wage, and that instead they were paid simply by how many chickens they caught when they got to a farm, with no consideration for how many hours it took to catch however many chickens they had to catch, without consideration for the number of hours they spent getting from one farm to another, let alone just getting from the houses from which they were picked up at to the first farm, and without consideration for time spent on call, which is, effectively they were alleged to be just having to respond whenever the Houghtons actually required them to work. Very seriously, they alleged that workers were threatened and abused by supervisors, including with the use of dogs. And as Antonis Galdikas, the lead claimant, describes it, he says, "We felt trapped, we felt we were being treated like slaves." So in 2012, many of our clients liberated themselves by basically going to the Citizens Advice Bureau and seeking refuge. Months later, the GLA and local police raided the Houghtons' premises and liberated about 30 more workers. The GLA described the Houghtons as the worst UK gangmaster ever, and while the police initially arrested the Houghtons, no prosecutions have ever taken place. So as I say, it wasn't until 2014 that the that the clients were introduced to myself and with some of my colleagues at Leigh, and we commenced proceedings pretty sharply after that. So the case is currently before the courts. In fact, we were in court last week, and we're waiting for judgment on an interim hearing as to whether or not aspects of the claim might actually be struck out or summary judgment entered. But I just want to put this all in context. So what we're talking about is it's been 3.5 years since our clients were liberated from exploitation and the alleged abuse. They still had no proper compensation. Several of the claimants are in very dire straits. Those who are able to work are trying to work, but those who are unable to work, and that includes for what we have had diagnosed as being psychiatric injuries, have had their benefits cut off and are at risk of homelessness. There's been no criminal prosecution, whether of the Houghtons or of the middleman that they blame a lot of the abuse on. The Houghtons have had their licence revoked, but there's evidence to suggest that they're still operating. And meanwhile, the Houghtons' defence is actually being financed by Aviva, their insurer. So even in terms of this litigation, what they're able to do is kind of sit back and wait as their insurer actually funds the solicitors and counsel under their insurance policy. And that defence that they're actually launching includes a statement that the defendants do not know what is meant by the assertion that the claimants were trafficked, and they invite the court to find that the assertion that they've been trafficked adds nothing to the facts in the case. So just getting back to this issue about putting all of this in context, as a victim of trafficking, I can certainly express what my clients have expressed to me, which is the absolute frustration of being in a circumstance where, despite having now access to litigation before the courts, they feel it takes far too long. They don't feel at the moment that there's been enough in terms of prosecutions. They don't feel like the Houghtons are actually being effectively brought to justice in a timely manner. And in circumstances where we have a company that we know, that's me saying 8 minutes, we know that Aviva has a very strong stance in relation to combating modern slavery and so on, but what we don't see is that necessarily reflected in a litigation process. So I think it's quite useful to talk about what does it mean to engage in litigation in the context of business and human rights from that broader perspective. Now, we're not suing Aviva, that's not what this is about, but actually just in terms of some of the advocacy that has been going on about modern slavery, and in the context of this discussion, where we're talking about the broader efforts to try and combat modern slavery.
Thanks very much, Shanta. That was an excellent, I think, very powerful exposition of what slavery means in the reality and why it's so important that we're doing what we're doing as a movement, I think, across the board to try and ensure we bring all weapons to the table, all tools to the table to